Hello, this is Guillermo Puyol with mobileprogrammingtips.com, and in today, the first episode of the series, we're going to go ahead and create a carnival game. You've seen the carnival game where you drop a coin or a little ball and it goes down these little pegs to get to the bottom, and if you get the one marked by the special number or different color, you get a prize. So we're going to be building some carnival games in this series, and we're starting out with this one. So what I've done is using the Unity Unity basic game objects. I have built this board. This is not a modeling tutorial, so I've shortened it by doing it this step already. You can always do, if you're better than me at modeling, you can create a much better model than this. So with that already done, what we're going to do is set it up correctly. So what I've done is every object here has its own collider. I've used capsule colliders for the little pegs and box colliders for everything else. You want to avoid mesh colliders if at all possible, because they're a lot more expensive when it comes to resources. Now what we're going to do is create our ball, and the ball is just a sphere, and it's also under the main game objects that you can create, and you want to make sure that the sphere is within the board. So you'll notice here is within the board, and what we're going to do next is make sure that the sphere is parented to the game board, so everything except the light and the camera is within the game board itself, the game board object. The reason why I do this is because we're going to be tilting everything back, so when I do it, it's a lot easier to just tilt everything all at once. Okay? So now that we have everything with colliders, the sphere is gonna have to have a rigid body. So you have the collider and the rigid body, and you can set up the sphere to have a pretty decent mass, so it falls and bounces nicely with the little pegs, and you can tweak the mass to get the results that you want. Just make sure that the sphere does use gravity, and of course the collider has to be a sphere collider. So when we hit play, you will see that the sphere falls down, hitting the little pegs. And let me get this view a little bit closer in. So let's see. I guess that will do. Game object align with view. It's a little bit better. And I see that our ball falls down, dodging the pegs, actually hitting the pegs and going all over the place. But now we need to figure out a way to make it so that it falls down and the sphere appears wherever we click. And the way we do that is by creating a trigger. So let's go ahead and reset this board rotation back to 0, so it's easy to work with. And we're going to create a cube. Let's go ahead and make the cube. Okay, now I can see it. and let's widen it. Okay, this cube doesn't have to be that thick, really does not matter, but what you want is to make sure that it's inside your board, so barely over the board level. So notice the little gap there, so you want it right over the board level, and you want to make sure that it covers the top part of the board without interfering with the pegs. So here's the line. You might not be able to see it well, but it's right here around the fourth line. So I'm going to shrink it down, move it right back up, and that should be good. Okay, so notice have a little bit of gap there, and maybe you can do it a little bit wider. Okay, so that's pretty good. And we're going to rename this to trigger, and we're going to write a script for the trigger so it detects our clicks. So let's go ahead and do that right now. I've created a scripts folder within my project. I'm going to right click, create, and I program in C#. So let's call this deploy ball. So this script is going to take a prefab, in this case the ball, and it's going to instantiate it wherever we click. So let's say ball public game object ball prefab, and then here we're going to say if input.mouse click, let's say get mouse button up. So if there's a mouse button up event, this is going to trigger. And what we're going to do is make sure that the mouse button event happened within that collider. So let's see how we can do that. Let's do a rake cast. Okay, so we're gonna need that, and this has to be lowercase. So what is our ray? The ray is gonna have to be a ray, and we take it from the camera. So camera dot main dot screen point to ray. So what we do is pass the vector position of our mouse. So input dot mouse position. So we give the mouse position where we clicked, and then that's going to give us a ray that goes from the center of the camera to that point in world coordinates of where we clicked. So now that we have the ray, we also need the hit info variable. So we're going to say raycast hit hit info. Okay, and we're missing a parenthesis here, So now this should trigger if there's a hit, whether it's on our trigger or not. So let's go ahead and do a debug log just to test out and make sure that we have no mistakes so far. And we're going to call the hitinfo.collider.name. So what should happen if I don't have any mistakes here is that whenever we click on something that has a collider, then the console will let us know what we hit. Now remember, we're not checking to make sure that we're hitting in the right spot. So let's nothing's happening because we didn't attach the script. Sorry about that. So we attach it to the trigger, and let's go ahead and hit play. And there we go. So now I'm clicking the board. I'm trying to click a peg. Let's try to click the ball, the sphere, and there's our trigger. Okay, so it works. Now we have to test whether we are actually hitting the board. So if this name is equal to trigger. Now, I don't like hard coding the name trigger, although we could do that, because if you go back and change that, trigger is no longer going to be valid. So let's go here. This is a better, smarter way to do this. Let's make a public string, or not even that. We can do game object trigger. So we're gonna have a trigger here, or a collider even. So we're going to have a trigger collider, and if hitinfo.collider is equal to the trigger, then let's go ahead and say that the trigger got hit. Okay, so now we're going to hit save. We go in here to the trigger, and it's asking for a trigger. Well, I'm sorry about that. We could make sure that it's only itself. So we don't need this variable here, and we can do that. So this is grabbing the collider from the game object that the script is attached. So if it has the trigger script, it's going to grab that collider. So let's try that. So it's hitting the board, and here it says trigger hit, which is exactly what we needed. Now that we're detecting the trigger hits, we need to instantiate the ball wherever the hit happened. So let's go ahead and do that now. So let's take these debugs statements off, and we're going to instantiate, and the object that we're instantiating is the ball prefab. We're going to instantiate it wherever the collision happens. So hitinfo.position.point, and then the rotation we do quaternion.identity, and that should be sufficient. And we actually don't need, sorry, We don't need this sphere anymore because it's already a prefab. So let's go ahead and deactivate it for now. You can later turn it off. So when I click, it's saying that the deploy bulb variable is not assigned, and the reason for that is that in the trigger we actually have to grab the prefab. Oh, we haven't created the prefab yet. I'm sorry about that. So let's drag the prefab out of the board game. Sphere out of the board game. Activate it. Drag it in. Oops, I was in play mode. I'm sorry. So activate it. Drag it out of the board game. Drag it into the prefabs folder. Okay. And the reason why I drag it out is so it has the correct scaling. And now we can go ahead and deactivate it because we have the prefab. Now we go to trigger. I want to put that trigger as part of the board so it rotates with the board. And here in the script, we're going to drag the sphere into the ball prefab. Okay, so what just happened? We parented the trigger so that it rotates correctly. Because remember that this game board can be rotated and the trigger needs to rotate as well. So let's go ahead and try that. And there's our ball. But if I click down here in the play area, nothing happens. When I click up here, we have a ball that gets created. Now, of course, I could sit here and do it all day, and if I click on the same spot, there's a weird thing that happens with collisions where what's happening is that the ball is being created in the same exact spot and they just explode. So we need to control all that. We don't want 3 balls to be created at the same time, and we definitely don't want balls flying off the board. So let's go ahead and control the number of turns and whether or not the player can send another ball. So we can do all that within the trigger script here. So let's do public integer balls. Okay, so let's say that we start out with three turns, and yes, the player can deploy. So we can do that in here. If can deploy, then if can deploy and balls is greater than 0, then instantiate it. But what we're going to do is decrease balls and we are going to say can deploy equals false. So we're decreasing the balls from 3 to 2 from 2 to 1, and we are making it so it cannot deploy for now, and this will only let us deploy 1 ball to begin with, and then nothing else will happen. So we need to, I'm clicking and it only let us do 1 time. So we need to make a decision on when we're going to allow the deployment to start again. So what I'm thinking is create another trigger, and let's call this bottom trigger. And let's resize it a little bit. Okay. So this bottom trigger is going to detect that a ball actually came in. Now we don't need this renderer, we don't need to see the trigger, but it's still there. And here in the script we're going to say public collider bottom trigger. Sorry. Let's go ahead and create a separate script for this trigger. Ball hit bottom. And let's say public on trigger enter. If the name of this collider, well actually if collider is equal to bottom trigger, then deploy ball dot can deploy equals true. So what I've done here is create a script that is going to reference the ball deployment trigger or script, and is detecting whether the ball has hit the bottom trigger, and if so, it's going to allow it to deploy another ball. So let's go ahead and save that, and we're going to put this in the sphere, and we're going to apply that to the prefab. Let's go ahead and try that script. See how it works. So let's look at the trigger. And here on the right hand side you'll notice can deploy is true and the number of balls is 3. So when I click on it, it says the number of balls is 2 and it can no longer deploy. So if we've done this correctly, when our ball hits that trigger at the bottom, it should switch this checkbox back to true so we can go ahead and hit our next shot. Trying to see something. Okay, here we have a problem. This bottom trigger should actually be a trigger. Under the box collider, select is trigger. So it allows penetration. If not, the ball is just going to sit there and float there on top of it, and our script will not fire. So let's try one more time now that I've changed that. Let's go back to our trigger object so we can see the script. I'm clicking, it no longer works. Okay, so we have this ball that's falling, and let's see what happens once it hits there, and watch the console for any errors that may come up. But if everything works correctly, as soon as it goes through that, okay, so it went through and it did not work as expected. Let's take a look at the documentation here. For untrigger enter. Trigger enter. Make sure that it's spelled correctly. Is it a... Oh, okay. Here's my problem. No. Collider, other. So we need to check and make sure that our sphere has a rigid body, and it does. Let's change this collision detection to continuous dynamic. Okay, so here's the problem we're having. In the script, we reference the bottom trigger and the deploy ball script, but we're never initializing it, because every time that we create a prefab, that needs to be referenced to an object within the scene. So let's go ahead and do that. In the start section of the script, we're going to say that bottom trigger is going to be equal to GameObject.find, and the name is going to be bottom trigger, and we're going to get the collider from that object, and the deploy ball is going to be GameObject.find, which just finds a game object within the scene, and is going to be the trigger, and we're going to get the component within that object, and the name of the component is going to be deploy ball. And then we do this to reference it, and that should actually, anytime a new ball is created, it's gonna tell which element in the scene should this be referred to. Okay, so let's go ahead and try that now. And one way to try it, to make sure it's working, is to click on it. Oops, it's not gonna work because our sphere is inactive. Okay, so now let's go ahead and try it. So here's the sphere. Let's pause that for a second and look at the sphere clone, the one that just got initialized, and look how now it's actually referencing the objects within the scene. So this should work if we follow the trajectory here and look at the console to make sure that we get a an event. And in fact, if we look at the trigger here, this should also switch back to can deploy. Okay, so now it says can deploy, so we can click the next ball, and I keep on clicking. Nothing happens, but when this ball gets to the bottom, it should allow us to deploy another ball. And it does. So now what I'm going to do is stop this. I'm going to align the camera a little bit. So I want to make sure that this fits. It's probably not. That's probably the best way to do it. Okay, that's a little bit better, just for so that the whole entire board fits in the scene. And in the next video we're going to do a little bit more of scoring and game over states and how you can actually win the game, because right now we have the main functionality of limiting the number of balls and the physics of it, but we need to make it into a game. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please make any comments you have, ask questions, like the video, share it, check out mobile programming tips on Facebook. I have a page there as well that you can ask questions on. And if you'd like me to create a specific Carnival game, put it in the comments and I'll see what I can do. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.